The great humanitarian Albert Schweitzer spent a good deal of his life studying Yeshua. And he wrote a book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, in which he argued that the great Galilean was basically an apocalypticist. In other words, Yeshua's main message had to do with the end of days and the soon coming kingdom of heaven. After all, didn't Yeshua specifically talk about coming doom? Didn't he stand on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem and prophesy its destruction? Those chilling words are still repeated today and frequently applied to world affairs. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved." Matthew 24. Albert Schweitzer concluded that all of these horrors were, in Yeshua's mind, just a precursor to the glorious Messianic age, the kingdom of heaven, which was shortly at hand. He noted that in the Gospel of Mark, Yeshua also speaks of a tribulation, with his coming in the clouds, with great power and glory. And that in the Matthew passage, he states when it will happen. "This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." But Schweitzer notwithstanding, several issues immediately present themselves. What is the kingdom of heaven? Is it an eschatological utopian age concomitant with the world to come? As usual, we're confronted with issues on top of issues. Did Yeshua even say such words at all?
The majority of textual critics assume that he didn't, because how could he possibly predict the destruction of the temple during the Great Revolt 30 years in advance? The entire passage must have been added decades after the fact by later Christian editors, intent on turning Yeshua, Jesus, into a pacifist of sorts, whose movement posed no threat to the Roman authorities. In theory, the same editors prominently highlighted Yeshua's famous quotation that if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other also. They theorized that the real Yeshua was much more likely to have supported the zealot cause. In declaring that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, he was expressing his faith not only that divine order will prevail in the world, but that the present world order will be turned upside down. Roman power will be brought down. The high and mighty will stumble. Some have argued that when Yeshua overturned the tables of the money changers on the Temple Mount, he was symbolically destroying the temple itself. In this view of the kingdom of heaven, he had much in common with the Dead Sea sect, who, while they did not prophesy the coming revolt against Rome, definitely saw Rome as an evil empire that will one day be crushed by God's elect in concert with divine power from on high. It amounted to an apocalyptic hope, coupled with a firm conviction that these were, in fact, the end of days. Some have theorized that the real face of the ancient Judeo-Christian Nazarene movement is revealed much more accurately in the Dead Sea Scrolls than it is in the Christian Gospels. The Dead Sea War Scroll, for example, in fact seems to prefigure the Great Revolt in this particular passage.
Truly, the battle is yours, and by the strength of your hand their corpses have been dashed to pieces so that no one can bury them. War Scroll 11:1. You have told us about the times and the wars of your hands, in order that you may glorify yourself among our enemies, to bring down the hordes of Belial. War Scroll 11:8. For you will do battle against them from the heavens. War Scroll 11:17. Bearing all this in mind, was Yeshua an ancient social activist out to right the wrongs of an oppressive society? Or was he even more radical, actively fanning the political flames that would erupt just 3 decades later in the Jewish war against Rome? As we've already noticed, Yeshua was a Galilean, and Galilee was the seedbed of anti-Roman agitation. And of course, no one disputes the fact that Yeshua was tried and executed as an insurrectionist. The real issue is whether he deserved to be called an insurrectionist at all. Are the Gospels right in depicting Pontius Pilate as recognizing that Yeshua was no threat and desiring to release him, but for the insistence of the crowd demanding his death? Or did Pilate correctly perceive Yeshua as a dangerous, even violent troublemaker in league with those who wanted a war?
But there is an opposing argument advanced by those who view Yeshua in very different terms. This approach finds nothing at all apocalyptic about Yeshua or his teachings. This viewpoint likewise recognizes the kingdom of heaven as the central theme of Yeshua's message, but it understands the kingdom of heaven in a fundamentally different way. It stands to reason that if you want to grasp the meaning of a particular term or expression, you have to find how it's used in other contexts. In what other literature does the term then appear? Well, we don't find the expression kingdom of heaven anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, nor do we find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we do find it in rabbinic literature, especially the Talmud. We are, in fact, able to find it in multiple places in the Talmud. The precise Hebrew term is Malchut Shamayim, the best translation being the reign of heaven, referring to the kingly authority of a monarch. It has nothing to do with eschatology or the end of days, nor is it future tense at all. It certainly isn't a place. It's the invisible power of the divine will in the lives of those Israelites who perform good deeds and keep the commandments.
Some scholars in this school of thought argue that there's no reason to doubt Yeshua's prophecy of the temple's destruction. They point out that this passage is absolutely consistent with Yeshua's kingdom of heaven and anti-war message. Moreover, the great sage Yochanan ben Zakkai was of the same opinion, counseling against war and actively opposing the zealots. From him and other sources, it appears that the kingdom of heaven was a well-defined concept employed against the zealots. Ben Zakkai even issued his own warnings that a course of rebellion would ultimately lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So this prophecy in the mouth of Yeshua wasn't really that remarkable and hardly needed to have been added later. In fact, anyone who really understood the threat posed by the zealots might have issued such a warning. We also read, "Whoever says the Shema, 'Hear, O Israel,' takes upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven." What does a yoke do but guide and restrain? And that's the role of the Torah in the life of the individual. Elsewhere, the Talmud admonishes not to worry about the yoke of Rome. For when enough people take upon themselves the yoke of the Torah, the yoke of Rome will fall off by itself. Yosei the Galilean is quoted as saying, "When Moses stood at the Red Sea and declared the Lord shall reign forever and ever, it is regrettable that he put it that way. For had he said the Lord has reigned forever and ever, the kingdom of heaven would have come about immediately." This was the attitude of the sages of the school of Hillel. What mattered was not whether one accepted Roman rule or rejected it, for the kingdom of heaven could come about at any time once the people repented and took upon themselves its yoke. Once that happens, no nation or tongue would hold sway over them. No rebellion against Rome would help, but Rome's empire would vanish once the people had taken upon themselves God's divine authority. There's nothing insurrectionist about this. It's not about the end time. It's about present tense behavior. According to this view, Yeshua understood exactly what the kingdom of heaven meant, and he therefore counseled against violence and insurrection. Elsewhere, he's quoted as saying, "If I, by the finger of God, cast out demons, then you will know that the kingdom of heaven has come upon you." Yeshua can well be understood as an exorcist of sorts and a healer, providing present tense deliverance to those suffering from all manner of maladies. What about the famous statement in the mouth of John the Baptist, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand"? One argument is that John never actually said this. The statement was placed in his mouth by later editors who wanted Yeshua and John to be on the same page, so to speak. According to this theory, the kingdom of heaven was not the message of John at all, but of Yeshua, who was on the same page with the rabbis and sages who later compiled the Talmud. John, it's argued, was indeed apocalyptic, expecting violent cataclysm coupled with divine intervention. If anyone was in line with the Dead Sea sect, it was not Yeshua, but John. It was Yeshua who declared that the kingdom of heaven, that is, the reign of God, is at hand. But what does that mean? It means right now, in the present. Yeshua also declared that from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. What does that mean? It means that although John anticipated the end of days and made no mention of the reign of God in the present, the kingdom of heaven has since then been breaking forth, as it were, violently. The violent are not those who take up arms, but those who are actively seizing divine power in their lives. In Yeshua's view, John the Baptist had indeed fulfilled a task in the process of the realization of the kingdom of heaven. Yeshua said, all the prophets prophesied until John. In other words, John the Baptist was the one who had begun the process of realization of the kingdom of heaven. And Yeshua then brought it to fulfillment through the dissemination of his ideas and the foundation of his movement. Yeshua believed that the kingdom of heaven would spread and be realized if he succeeded in developing around him a movement which would bring people to repent and thus avoid the threat of destruction at the hands of the Romans. As with so much else, these two views of Yeshua and the kingdom of heaven could not be farther apart. And certain scholars and critics retort that it's inaccurate to define the meaning of a term like the kingdom of heaven based on rabbinic literature compiled centuries later. When Yeshua used it, it may indeed have been a term denoting the end of days.
Which side of the debate do you suppose is right, Watson? The clues are all there. We just have to put them together. One thing is certain. The way we engage this debate fundamentally determines how we view the historical Yeshua, Jesus. What do I think? I'm not going to tell you. The only real question is, what do you think?